This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
What if an appliance emergency didn't have to be? If your appliances suddenly decided they were done, don't stress. Best Buy has you covered with a wide variety of major appliances from trusted brands, in stock and available now. So you don't have to worry about laundry piling up, refilling the fridge, or that big dinner party you're hosting. Because Best Buy has the knowledge and expertise to get you the right appliance for your home. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
And welcome to episode 192 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Have you ever heard of the legend of the Jersey Devil? It's a myth and legend that involves a deer or horse-like creature with wings that haunts and attacks people in the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey. Of course, at the time this legend seems to have started, the Pine Barrens weren't in southern New Jersey. They were located in the English colony of West Jersey. You know, New Jersey is actually a really interesting place to study the history of early America, because it's a state that emerged from a British colony that developed out of two English colonies. And those two English colonies developed out of a colony that was first established by the Swedes and then later taken over by the Dutch. So, needless to say, New Jersey has a rich and fun early American past for us to explore, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to start exploring it. Brian Regal, an associate professor of history at Kean University, will serve as our guide as we make our first official foray into New Jersey's past. And our entry point for this foray will be the story of the New Jersey Devil. Now, what can we learn about New Jersey by exploring its most famous myth? Brian reveals details about colonial New Jersey and its population, information about the political and religious culture of early New Jersey, and how a dispute between Quakers led to the creation of New Jersey's most famous legend. But first, just a reminder that we're meeting up soon. In fact, our Boston meetup is just about 10 days away. We're meeting up on Sunday, July 8 at 10 a.m. on Boston Common. We'll meet at the corner on Park and Tremont Street, and then I'll take you for a 2-hour tour of Boston that focuses on its role in the American Revolution. Then, on Saturday, July 21, we're meeting up in Cleveland. Now, I am still working out the details of this meetup. It's going to take place, it will be fun, and I'll send you an email with all the details as soon as I have them. Which reminds me, if you'd like to receive an email reminder about these meetups and all their details, be sure you join the Ben Franklin's World email list. It's easy to sign up. Just text BFWorld to 33444. Okay, are you ready for our first official adventure into New Jersey's past? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is an associate professor of history at Kean University in Union, New Jersey. His research specialties include the history of science, technology, and medicine. His last book, Searching for Sasquatch, Crackpots, Eggheads, and Cryptozoology, explored the history of the search for Bigfoot, while his latest book, which he co-wrote with Frank Esposito, The Secret History of the Jersey Devil, How Quakers, Hucksters, and Benjamin Franklin Created a Monster, investigates the history of the myth and legend of the New Jersey Devil. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Brian Regal.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So Brian, just judging from your book titles, you seem to be really fascinated by myths, legends, and creatures. And I wonder if you would tell us how you became interested in these topics, and how you came up with the idea that you could employ your skills as a historian to investigate them.
Well, I was always interested in the weird, the strange, the offbeat. A lot of historians like to focus on the big important figures like Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, but I was always drawn to the sort of, fringe people, crazy people off at the edges and strange ideas and things that were not considered mainstream and topics that hadn't really been studied before. And I've done a lot of writing on evolution theory and its role in American history and politics and religion. And I started coming across these stories of monsters, and it kind of re-energized my interest. And I did some looking around, and, historians, whenever we start to think about researching a topic, our first question is always, where are the letters? Where are the papers? Where are the lost rare books? And I started looking around, and I saw there was tons of stuff available on monster history. And there'd been a huge amount of work, really excellent work done on monsters in Europe, but very little done on monsters in American history. And I thought that we can learn a lot about the past by looking at things at the edges, things at the fringe, things that just sort of barely cling to our mainstream culture. And as I did that, not only did I see that there was quite a bit of historical material out there that no one had ever looked at, but that this sort of material really gives us some interesting insights into American history and in history in general.
You mentioned that we historians, once we decide we're going to research a topic, become a bit obsessed with finding where the sources are, which, is a fair point. But I wonder if you could expand on this point a bit by telling us, as a historian, how you go about investigating a myth, legend, or creature.
Well, with my previous book, the Sasquatch book, it was somewhat easier because the main character in the story, Grover Krantz, had recently passed away and left his huge collection of private papers to the Smithsonian. So it was just a matter of going down there and going through all that. With the Jersey Devil, it was a little different because it's a much earlier story and there isn't as much manuscript material from these characters involved. In part because it was a long time ago, and in part as the story develops, you begin to realize that Daniel Leeds and his son, Titan Leeds, had their work intentionally destroyed because there were those in the community who were opposed to it, didn't like it. And so they burned his almanacs, they burned his books. It's clear, for example, from the circumstantial evidence that Daniel Leeds had a significant private library. Probably one of the choicest private libraries in the Middle Atlantic colonies at the time. That is completely gone. We have no idea what happened to it. It's also clear that he corresponded quite a bit with other people as far away as Boston, and yet none of that correspondence survives. We're still hoping that maybe some Leeds descendant somewhere, finds an old box out in a barn someplace and opens it up and finds, sheaths of Daniel Leeds correspondence, but that hasn't happened yet. And so what we then did was you do what you always do is you go to the next level of sources. You start finding or looking for published material, references in other sources, letters to editors. And we basically just went through and did our jobs as historians and dug up as much material as we could so that we could tell the story.
Toward the end of your book, you and your co-author, Frank Esposito, mentioned that it's really important for us to check and verify our sources, especially with the type of historical materials that you were working with. So I wonder if you would tell us why we need to check and verify our sources, when we research any topic.
Well, obviously, when historians are writing, we don't have the luxury of making stuff up. We have to build our stories around the facts and evidence. And so it's always important to check to make sure you're not being misled or you're not using a source which somebody else already knows is spurious. For example, within the world of Jersey Devil studies, there's a thing called the Vance Larner Diary, which aficionados point to and they say, well, here's something that was written by a guy who lived in West Jersey in the 1790s, and he talks about seeing this monster in the woods, the Leeds Devil, so therefore it's true. That would be great if the Vance Larner Diary was authentic. And when we began this project, one of the things we wanted to make sure we did was to go and check this out because it gets repeated online on web pages and things. And so we went and we checked everywhere. We talked to everyone we knew. We went through the Library of Congress. We went through libraries everywhere from Boston to Baltimore. And we could find no evidence that this Vance Larner diary ever actually existed. And so we say in the book that, here's this thing. It's brought up a lot by Jersey Devil aficionados. But as far as we can tell, it's fake. It never existed. But then, of course, we always hold out hope that if somebody ever does find and produce the original and it's verified, then we'll change our minds.
Okay, now that we've had a behind-the-scenes look at your investigation, why don't we explore some of the details from The Secret History of the Jersey Devil? In your book, The Secret History of the Jersey Devil, you and your co-author Frank Esposito found that in order for us to understand the myth and legend and how it came to be, we need to understand two different histories. The first is the context in which the original story came to exist, and the second is how the legend of the Jersey Devil came to develop a life of its own outside of this original story. So, Brian, I think it makes sense for us to begin with this first story. What exactly is the original myth or legend of the Jersey Devil?
Okay, one of the things we have to remember about all this is that, as you pointed out, there are actually two devil stories here. There's the original Leeds Devil story, and then there's the later Jersey Devil story. And there'd be no Jersey Devil if there wasn't a Leeds Devil. There would be no Leeds Devil if there wasn't a Daniel Leeds. And so the basic Jersey Devil mythology says that in 1735, a witch named Mother Leeds gives birth to a 13th child, which turns out to be a monster, which then escapes and spends, eternity running around the Pine Barrens scaring people. That's the commonly held version of the story today. What we found out was that the origins of that story do start back in the colonial era because of the work of this man named Daniel Leeds, who is a Quaker who comes to what is then West Jersey. There's no New Jersey yet, and settles within the Quaker community that itself had just begun in Burlington a few years before that. And he begins to try to make a life for himself. He wants to be a man of position and social import. And he has this idea in his head that the way he will contribute to his society is by bringing the ideals and the philosophy of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution to the edge of the empire, which was then New Jersey. And in his attempt to do that, he runs into his fellow Quakers who are not exactly happy with what he thinks is a wonderful idea. And they will resist his attempt to do this. And in the process, he will sort of develop a bad reputation within the Quaker community, and they start referring to him as evil. And at one point, he is referred to in print as Satan's harbinger. And that is what begins this sort of long, arduous intellectual trek from the late 1600s to the early 20th century, in which this story goes from being the story of a guy who's trying to improve his society to a monster running around the woods.
And speaking of the monster running around in the woods, what exactly did it look like? I mean, how did the Quakers and others who disagreed with this Daniel Leeds portray him as a monster?
Right. Well, see, that's the interesting thing. This whole idea of a physical monster, which for those in the audience who don't know the story, the Jersey Devil is supposed to look sort of like, a cross between a deer and an emaciated horse with wings. And none of that really begins until the sort of post-Civil War period. And in the early stages of the Leeds Devil story, the devil is more of a political animal. One of the things that helps sort of ruin Daniel Leeds' career is because he has the bad fortune of siding with the empire. When Lord Cornbury, the first governor of New Jersey, comes into power in the early 1700s, Daniel Leeds is made one of his counselors. And so the Leeds family gets this reputation as being people who are siding with the British government, with the empire. And as the first sort of stirrings of independence begin to spread throughout the region, the Leeds family name is attached to the government. It's a kind of anti-government slur to call someone the Leeds devil. And so that whole sort of monstery thing that we're familiar with now doesn't really come along till later.
A lot of the Leeds devil story seems to be entangled in the early history of New Jersey. So would you tell us more about this history? What exactly is the colonial history of New Jersey?
Starting in about the 1615s, 1620s, you start to get the very first Euro settlers coming to the region south of New York that will eventually be called New Jersey. And they're mostly Swedes, not in large numbers, and they kind of go off into the woods, and they don't really do all that much. They start little farms, that kind of thing. But what really sort of kicks this whole thing into gear is the anti-Quaker hysteria going on back in England. A number of anti-Quaker laws are passed in England. The Puritans and the Anglicans have a real problem with the Quakers because the Quakers tended to reject centralized authority. And in fact, Daniel Leeds' father, Thomas, is actually imprisoned in the Tower of London because he's a Quaker. And that is part of the impetus that will push Quaker people, including the Leeds family, to come to North America. And a lot of them go to Boston at first, where they run into just more persecution at the hands of the Puritans. And then they hear that there's this area down south of them along a big river that comes in right off the ocean, eventually will be called the Delaware. And so they start heading down there. George Fox heads down there. William Penn goes down there. And they find this place along the river that sort of appeals to them. And they begin a settlement. And that will become Burlington. And that will become the center of Quaker life in West Jersey. And then the population will just grow and grow and grow from there.
That's really interesting that New Jersey seems to have started as two different colonies, East Jersey and West Jersey. And I wonder if you would tell us more about these two colonies and how they eventually merged into this single colony of New Jersey.
Yeah, well, what happens is in England, during the period where the monarch is deposed and Charles I is kicked out and Charles II, who is a little kid at the time, they go off into the wanderings. And one of the people who helps the future king, Charles II, evade capture is a guy named Carteret. And Carteret will be rewarded for this. The king gives him this huge chunk of land south of New York City. And because Carteret's family came from the island of Jersey, he calls it New Jersey. And so the part that kind of wraps around the region where New York is, that will come to be known as East Jersey. And then the part that wraps around the Delaware River and eventually where Philadelphia will show up, that becomes West Jersey. And they'll stay more or less separate holdings until about 1700 or so. Right around the time that Scotland is being annexed into part of England, the British government decides to take East and West Jersey and sort of bolt them together as a royal colony. And that will become New Jersey. And that's when Lord Cornbury takes over as governor.
You know, when we look at the history of New York in particular, which started as a Dutch colony called New Netherland, we see a lot of cultural tension and divisions within the colony because of its origins in the Dutch Empire and its really diverse population. And I wonder if East and West Jersey experienced similar cultural tensions, you know, given its origins as a Swedish colony and then a Dutch colony and then finally an English colony.
Well, in New Jersey's case, there's always a lot of different groups. You know, we could get the misunderstanding that somehow West Jersey is a Quaker colony. And while Quakers do sort of predominate and they will take over the local government, which is one of the things that leads to the tensions that Daniel Leeds will get caught up in, there are Anglicans, there are some Puritans down there, there are Catholics living down there, not to mention the Lenape people who have already been living there for, since the dawn of time. And so it is a rather cosmopolitan area that doesn't really suffer the religious and political tensions, certainly not at first, that will sort of ravage Boston and New York.
You just said that West Jersey could be portrayed as a Quaker colony, and I wonder if you would tell us a bit more about the Quakers and about the specific influence they had on the development of New Jersey.
Well, the Quakers start off as nonconformists. There's a big movement back in England in the middle of the 1600s, where you have the Protestant Reformation, which sort of hits England a little behind the way it does Europe. And you have King Henry and the dissolution of the monasteries and all that sort of thing takes place. And the country, England that is, sort of splits between Catholics and mostly Puritans. And then you get the rise of the Anglicans as well. So you have these three major religious groups kind of battling for dominance, political and social dominance. And as a result, there are people who are not really happy with any of those groups. And they begin to create their own way. And so you have people like the Muggletonians, for example, and the Quakers, who are sort of lumped together as nonconformists. And the basic underlying theology of Quakerism, and I mean, at first they don't call themselves Quakers. They call themselves the Society of Friends. It's detractors, it's anti-society people who begin calling them Quakers because they believe that one of the ways you got close to God was by dancing. And so people would make fun of the Friends and say, oh, look at them, they're quaking for God. And so the term Quaker came along. But they basically believed that there shouldn't be anything in between you as a believer and God or Jesus except the Bible. They rejected political authority. They rejected religious authority. Some really extreme Quakers rejected even the idea of wearing clothes in public, which always got them in trouble. And so anytime a power structure sees somebody coming up below them who reject the very notion of power structure, those in charge will get nervous and will start coming down on these newcomers. And that's what leads to the Quakers being persecuted because they were basically anti-government. It wasn't so much that they were anti-government, but that they felt government was irrelevant. And so you had to find your own way, your own authority through God. And that is what allowed you to get closer to God because priests and pastors and preachers only got in the way. And that upset everyone who was not a Quaker.
You also mentioned that the Quakers, when they settled in North America, would go down to the Delaware River Valley. And we know that some of the Quakers settled in West Jersey, and many more would settle in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And I wonder if the Quakers who settled in West Jersey and Pennsylvania were all part of the same migration out of England, or whether they were two different groups.
No, it was essentially the same sort of wave of people. Philadelphia actually is founded after Burlington. People somehow tend to think that Philadelphia was somehow there forever. But Philadelphia actually doesn't appear until after Burlington is established. But it all comes out of the same migratory impulse to get out of England. They go to Boston and they find that isn't really that great either. And so they hear about all this land down here south of them where there are native people who were sort of friendly, that is the Lenapes, and you could build a society away from the persecution of the Puritans and the Anglicans. And so that Burlington, Philadelphia nexus sort of becomes the ground central. And out of that, Quakers start spreading east back towards the coast, back towards the Jersey Shore, and then west deeper into Pennsylvania.
Given that New Jersey and Pennsylvania are neighboring colonies and they have this shared Quaker religion, did they also have a shared cultural and political alliance, or did they operate like two different colonies?
Well, they saw each other as connected because they were all Quakers, and they all sort of had the same idea of creating this. It wasn't a utopian idea, but the idea that you could create a place where people of any kind, where people could be sort of allowed to live their own lives, where the Puritans really persecuted Quakers and witches and native people. The Quakers never really did that, which is why they tend to get along. Despite the fact that you do have Puritans and Anglicans and Catholics down in West Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania, they don't really get into much conflict with one another. And they don't really get into much conflict with the native people and vice versa, because the Quakers tended to treat the native people decently and equally. In fact, in the concessions and agreements, which is one of the first major documents discussing liberty and freedom in America, the Quakers who put this together come out and say, we're going to have equal rights for women, we're going to have equal rights for people of color, we're going to have equal rights for the native people. So they were really striving to create a kind of land where It didn't matter who you were in the sort of the best democratic sense of the word.
Okay, to go back to the story of the Leeds Devil, now that we have a lot of context in place, earlier you mentioned that the creation of the Leeds Devil started with a dispute between Daniel Leeds and his fellow Quakers. And I wonder if you would tell us about this dispute in more detail.
Sure. As I said before, Daniel Leeds' basic underlying idea, he wants his life to be more than just farming. He wants his life to be more than just making barrels and making money. He wants to do something intellectual, something philosophical. He sort of sees himself as becoming a kind of wise old sage who would wander the back roads of the Pine Barrens, dispensing wisdom and philosophy, and help bring his neighbors to a much higher intellectual level. And so to do this, he creates an almanac which gets printed by William Bradford, one of the very first printers in North America. Bradford's also a Quaker, and Bradford thinks Leeds is onto something. They become good friends. And so they produce this single sheet, broadsheet almanac, which Daniel Leeds is very proud of. And that's in 1687. And he thinks the minute this thing hits the shelves, everyone's going to be so happy. They're going to be slapping him on the back and saying, this is wonderful. You did a great job. And he is sorely disappointed because the Quaker elders react in the exact opposite way he was hoping they would react. They saw his use of astrology as a little too occult, a little too unchristian. And so they basically round up all of the copies, or at least as many of the copies of his almanac as they can get their hands on, and they destroy them. I had to go all the way to London to the British Library. They have a fragmentary copy and a full copy of that very first almanac in order to see one. So he's upset that they did this. And so then he decides, well, maybe I wasn't clear in what I was doing. So he sits down over the course of the next year or so, and he writes this book called The Temple of Wisdom. First book written south of Boston. He's the first New Jersey author. William Bradford publishes this as well. And the Quaker fathers hate this even more than they hated the almanac. And they go around and, just like with the almanac, they scoop up every copy they can find and destroy them. We would only know that this thing exists because there's one forlorn, sad, lonely copy of the Temple of Wisdom in the collection of the Pennsylvania Historical Society. And so the Quakers don't just destroy his work, they make him come in and apologize for it, which must have been sort of insulting and degrading. And this is what will lead Daniel Leeds to decide to break with the Quakers. And rather than spending the rest of his life as a wise old owl imparting wisdom, he decides to turn himself into a political attack dog. And he will spend the rest of his life attacking the Quakers and showing up their supposed crimes in a whole series of books where he basically says, anybody who's a Quaker is a terrible person, and they lie and they cheat and they steal, they don't pay their bills, and they get up to no good, and they're adulterers, and every possible bad thing you could say about someone. And that will, of course, cause the Quakers to react against him, and they start publishing pamphlets and almanacs that are anti-Daniel Leeds. And so through all of this turmoil, the Quakers begin referring to Daniel Leeds as a terrible person. At one point in the records, they call him evil. And then one of the great Quaker apologists, Cal Pusey, who becomes Daniel Leeds' great enemy, publishes a book in which he calls Leeds Satan's harbinger. Now, in the 21st century, someone calling you the devil isn't really that big a deal. It's almost adorable. It's almost cute. But in the early 1700s, in this particular world, to accuse someone of being in league with the devil was really quite a serious attack. And so that's what is creating this tension. And Leeds will quit the Quakers. He'll convert to Anglicanism. He gets hooked up with George Keith and the Keithian Schism, which tears the Quaker community in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania to pieces. And this is where we see what will eventually become the origins of first the Leeds Devil and then the Jersey Devil.
Wow. That's quite the story, and it really seems like this whole dispute between Daniel Leeds and the Quakers was really about philosophical and religious differences that became apparent when Leeds published his almanac. So, Brian, I wonder if you would tell us what exactly an almanac is, why Leeds thought that his neighbors would be excited to have one, and why the Quakers objected to this almanac so much.
Okay, well, almanacs were really quite popular at the time, especially in Europe and England, which is part of how Leeds gets the inspiration to do an almanac, because he knows that these are publications which have a wide publication, which people read and have influence in society. Now, when William Bradford comes over with his printing press, he doesn't have an elaborate setup yet. And so what they decide to do is, rather than do the sort of booklet version, which was already well established in England, they do a broadsheet version, which is basically just one sheet of paper where you run it through the printing press once, it prints on one side, the other side is blank. And that way it's relatively cheap, it's quick and easy, and was really nothing in that first Leeds Almanac that was particularly, certainly by our standards, not particularly problematic, but because of his use of astrology and reference to the various planets and their movements, there were members within the Quaker community who saw this as inappropriate and a little too close to being pagan and occult-like. And so that's why they come down on him. That's why they destroy the first almanac. And later on, after they destroy the Temple of Wisdom, he basically just throws caution to the wind. He says, I tried to get these people to become enlightened. They threw it back in my face. I'm going to reissue the almanac again. I'm going to start doing it again, and I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to listen to what anybody says. I'm going to put in there what I think should be put in there. And so he starts putting in all sorts of ideas about how astrology helps you become a better Christian. One of the things that is really fascinating about this period is that, like today, for example, people tend to have this very black and white, inflexible view of the relationship of religion to science and the occult and whatever way you want to define that. But in Daniel Leeds' day, a lot of Christian philosophers thought that the occult wasn't something to be afraid of. It was something which allowed you to get closer to God. That the occult and astrology and alchemy allowed you to understand the workings of the universe more clearly. And if you understood the workings of the universe more clearly, you understood God more clearly. And so he was quite taken aback when people reacted negatively to this. And so he just starts saying, look, I want to talk about astrology. I'm going to talk about astrology. I want to talk about astronomy. I want to talk about math and history. And I don't care what the elders say. They're not my elders anymore. And I'm just going to do this. He is, in fact, the first person in the Middle Atlantic states to publicly support the Copernican heliocentric view of the universe, the idea that the Earth goes around the sun, which was not an idea that was widely accepted yet. The year before, or the year that the Temple of Wisdom comes out, the year before that is when Isaac Newton publishes the Principia. So Leeds is right there in the sort of thick of the action of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And he's very well read. He's read Copernicus. He's read books on astrology and mathematics and history. And this is what he wants to bring to his neighbors, and they just reject it completely. And I think that is what leads him to turn his back on the Quakers and begin this pamphlet and book war that will eventually lead a century and a half later to the Jersey Devil.
So Daniel Leeds goes on to print this almanac, which is the origin of all his conflicts with the Quakers. How long did Leeds publish this almanac? Were people actually going out and buying this almanac if the Quakers were so against it? And I guess what I'm wondering is how did the rest of the almanac story play out?
Well, that very first almanac only comes out in one issue, the very first issue. That's the 1687 issue, which gets destroyed. And so he stops doing it for a couple of years while he writes and then publishes the Temple of Wisdom. Once the Temple of Wisdom gets rejected, Leeds decides to go back to the almanac format, and he will drop the broadsheet approach and he'll go with the traditional booklet, because that way he has lots of pages to say the sort of things he wants to say. And they will start selling, and it sells well. And Daniel Leeds retires in the 17 teens, and turns the publication of the almanac over to his next youngest son, Titan, who will publish it until he passes away in the 1730s. So it's quite widely known and it's read widely, which is why when Ben Franklin comes along and he decides to publish an almanac, Franklin knows that his primary competition is the Leeds Almanac. And that's why he goes after Titan Leeds, basically as a way to undermine the sales of the Leeds Almanac and to promote sales of what will become Poor Richard.
You just mentioned Benjamin Franklin, and you alluded to the fact that he and Titan Leeds became involved in a dispute of their own over their almanacs. And this is a story we really need to hear right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. The Omohundro Institute has been the proud publisher of award-winning books since 1943. And if you're looking for an interesting read this summer, you might check out one of the Omohundro Institute's most recent titles, Molly Warsh's American Baroque, Pearls and the Nature of Empire, 1492 to 1700. Published in partnership with the University of North Carolina Press, this book takes a deep dive into Spain's exploitation of Caribbean pearl fisheries to trace the origins of Spain's maritime empire. Warsh demonstrates how, in the 1500s, the legal and illegal trade in pearls gave rise to global networks and connected the Caribbean to both the Indian Ocean and the pearl-producing regions of the Chesapeake and Northern Europe. Now, pearls were a commodity that defied easy categorization. People coveted them, but they didn't always tax or value pearls as a luxury good. Instead, pearls served as a symbol of status, which people all along the economic spectrum wore and traded. So, in many ways, pearls stood as a symbol of their imperial time. They connected people through a network of new shores, and they also caused violence in disputed territories. So, this is one book that we'll be reading at the Omohundro Institute this summer. What books will you be reading? Let us know by dropping us a comment in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. It's free to join. Just text BF World to 33444 and click the link that I'll send you. So, Brian, we really need to hear the story of Ben Franklin and Titan Leeds. What exactly was Franklin's dispute with Titan, and does Franklin have any connection with the Leeds devil?
Okay, so the Leeds Almanac is the almanac in the region. It's the one everybody reads. Along comes Ben Franklin to Philadelphia, who wants to build a career as a printer and wants to make a name for himself. And he wants to put out an almanac for basically the same reasons that Daniel Leeds originally wanted to put out an almanac. And so Franklin realizes that he can gain attention through controversy. He's really quite a pioneer in that Franklin understands that people will believe the most outrageous stuff. You know, we tend to think that fake news and public lying is somehow, we originated this in the 21st century. But Ben Franklin understood that you can get people to buy your almanac if you made up crazy stories. And so what Franklin does is he says in his guise as Richard Saunders that he has done the alchemical and astrological computations, and they all prove that his friend Titan Leeds will die in 1736. Titan Leeds doesn't get the joke. He takes it seriously. He gets very upset. And he comes out and says, well, I don't know who this Franklin guy is, but he's a liar and he doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm still alive. And Franklin keeps a straight face. He never breaks. And every time Titan Leeds responds seriously, Franklin responds with a joke, which only makes Titan Leeds more upset. At one point, Franklin says, I don't know who this is who's yelling at me, but I was good friends with Titan Leeds, and he would never say such horrible things about me. Therefore, this must be the ghost of Titan Leeds. That Titan Leeds is dead, and this is his ghost come back to haunt me. So he's doing this in order to drum up sales for his almanac. And he engages in a good old-fashioned sort of tabloid war with Titan Leeds.
And was this gambit by Franklin successful? Did people actually start to go out and buy Poor Richard's almanac to read about this dispute or, as you said, tabloid war of sorts?
Yeah, of course it was. The Leeds almanac dwindles and disappears, and everybody now remembers Poor Richard's almanac. Nobody remembers the Leeds almanac. And so it was very successful.
So, is there any direct connection between Franklin's dispute with Titan and the story of the Leeds Devil, or how it emerged as the Jersey Devil monster story?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Franklin is not trying to create a legend. He's just trying to sell almanacs. And if he can have a little fun, poking fun at Titan Leeds, he's more than happy to do that. But he really had no idea that he was contributing to something many, many years later, which would become this monster legend. But others will look back and say, oh, Ben Franklin was involved in this. And so you'll see some books, even books written in the 19th century, that claim that Franklin was sparring with Daniel Leeds. And that's completely untrue. He spars with Titan Leeds. He never really mentions Daniel Leeds at all. And so these bits and pieces that will come apart and slowly but surely then start to come back together again. The origins of the Jersey Devil legend, like any myth, is very complicated. And it comes together through lots of bits and pieces, through political upheavals, through religious contradiction, through land grabs, through battles with the government, with relations between the Euro-Americans and the Lenape people, and squabbles over who's in charge, and should women be allowed to have any power or should they be kept down? So it's this swirl of material that at first will produce this kind of political animal in the Leeds Devil. The Leeds family is un-American. They side with the empire. Don't believe anything the Leeds tell you. And then eventually that will slowly change over the course of the 19th century. And by the early 20th century, you now have a monster story, which is completely divorced from those original characters.
Okay, so just before we move on to the modern day Jersey Devil story, did Benjamin Franklin know about Daniel Leeds and this Leeds Devil story? Or was his sparring with Titan Leeds and pretending Titan's death just an event that is completely unrelated to this larger myth?
Yeah, we think it's mostly the latter. I think it's mostly Franklin simply trying to build a career and build an audience for his product, which were the almanacs and books he was printing. Franklin was himself a Quaker, and so Franklin doesn't come along very much later than the almanac and pamphlet wars between Daniel Leeds and the Quakers. So I'm sure he was familiar with it. He was sort of a political social gadfly. He was up on all the latest stuff going on, all the gossip. So I'm sure he knew about it.
So what was the final version of the Leeds Devil story that emerged from the colonial period, and how did this myth transform into this legend of the New Jersey Devil?
By the end of the early Republic, the 1830s, 40s, the memory of the Leeds family and the idea of the Leeds Devil has all but gone extinct. Not very many people are aware of it, mostly just people in the Pine Barrens. And it's by this time that the notion of a Leeds Devil, apart from the political implications, begins to sort of morph with European notions of monstrous births and creatures in the woods, and the Lenape, who have a long tradition of an extensive theology of forest monsters and forest spirits, begins to turn the Leeds Devil into a monster. The earliest mention we could find in print about the Leeds Devil comes from the 1840s in an article in which the author is traveling through New Jersey looking to find out about the people who live in the Pine Barrens, the Pineys. And he encounters a woman named Hannah Butler who sort of almost offhandedly tells him the story about the Leeds Devil being a monster. And this is something he's never heard before. And the person who's telling him this story, midway through, sort of realizes she's giving away a little too much, and she stops and she refuses to say anything else, and they leave. And so the guy writes this story about the Leeds Devil as a beast, as a creature in the woods, because this is the story he hears from Hannah Butler. And so that idea, the idea that the Leeds Devil was no longer a kind of political animal or religious figure, is now a monster, a physical monster, has taken place by then. So people in the 1830s, 1840s, the few people who know the story not as Daniel Leeds, but as a monster. And that monstrous image will sort of sputter along through the 19th century, after the Civil War, you'll see a few newspaper articles appearing here and there where something happens and people say, oh, well, my granddaddy said there was something called the Leeds Devil and it was a monster. And so that's how this thing starts to slowly but surely morph into the Jersey Devil of the 20th century.
And what about this idea of the Jersey Devil? The idea of the monster. Is this a legend that is alive and well today?
I give talks on this all the time. And, one of the first things I say is, I'm here to disappoint you. I'm going to tell you that there really is no monster in the woods. And then I tell them the story. And afterwards, where you do that thing where the after talk, where people come up and want to shake your hand and say, thanks a lot for coming. It was really interesting. And I never thought of it that way. Almost every single time I give a talk about this, someone will come up to me and say, man, I love this. Oh, this was so interesting. But I've seen the Jersey Devil, so I know it's real. So there are people who still think this, is actually a creature running around. There are a number of organized groups and individuals who go out into the Pine Barrens on a fairly regular basis with their night vision goggles and their motion detectors and their video cameras wanting to catch a glimpse of this sort of emaciated horse with wings that they think is running around the Pine Barrens.
Now, in the introduction to The Secret History of the Jersey Devil, you and your co-author Frank Esposito state that the Jersey Devil is not just a local story, but a story that illuminates a forgotten chapter in American history. A story that involves national origins, religious bigotry, land grabs, and even failed intellectual pursuits. So we have this story that contains all these different elements, and I wonder, how can we use this story of the Leeds and Jersey Devils to better understand the larger history of early America?
Well, we have this kind of view of the colonial period. A lot of people do. Historians obviously don't because we know better. But the sort of general public have this view of the colonial period as men and women, strolling down quaint paved streets in front of wonderful colonial buildings and smiling and saying good day to one another, and that there's really no conflict going on. It was almost a sort of paradise. And the reality is colonial America is built on a kind of raw, bare knuckle political infighting that would make the stuff that goes on today seem almost tame by comparison. Lying about each other, undermining each other's positions, calling each other names. It was quite a kind of raucous and riotous time that never really ended. We think we've invented all this stuff in the 21st century, but colonial America was already engaging in this kind of fake news, political hack lying and name calling already. And that this is part of our national origins, and that people became convinced that monsters were running around. And whether it was the monster of the empire or an actual monster with fangs and leathery wings in the woods, this is one of the ways that people deal with disappointment, with crumbling careers, with things not going the way you want them to go, the idea of scapegoating political figures. This is all something that our country is based on. I mean, the whole idea of Mother Leeds. And we sort of equated Mother Leeds in a rough kind of way with Anne Hutchinson, the colonial political activist up in Boston, that you have this idea that women who speak out, women who want to make their voices heard, women who feel they should be treated equally are seen as pariahs within the society. This is something which is still very topical. The idea that there are those in society who think women should shut up and know their place, and if they don't, they should be punished. In large part, the story of Mother Leeds is that this is an outspoken woman who is punished by God by being forced to bear this monstrous child. And so these are all ideas that are still relevant today and still haunt us, if I could use the word haunt.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Daniel Leeds had not become entangled in a dispute with his fellow Quakers? Would the story of the Leeds Devil have developed? Would Benjamin Franklin have picked it up during his almanac dispute with Titan? Would the history of New Jersey be different without the development of this legend?
Oh, yeah, I think colonial history would have been rather different. Leeds wants to improve his society. He wants to bring the Enlightenment. He wants to bring the scientific revolution to New Jersey and Pennsylvania and raise the whole place up intellectually. And had the Quaker elders not rejected his almanac and his book, The Temple of Wisdom, I think he would clearly have continued writing philosophical works. That's what he wanted to do. There would have been no reason why he would have stopped. And so without that conflict, you would never have had the creation of the Leeds Devil, which means Ben Franklin would never have used it against Titan Leeds. And so, as I mentioned before, Daniel Leeds had, we think, a fairly extensive library. And who knows, that library could have gone on to become the nexus of a great library in New Jersey and maybe a university. Who knows how people would have been affected by Leeds bringing these ideas to the cultural wilderness. I said if Daniel Leeds had been born, maybe a generation later, we wouldn't be talking about him as the father of a monster. We might be talking about him as a founding father. A lot of Leeds men went on to fight in the Revolution, which is ironic because Leeds gets accused of being a supporter of the empire. But once the Revolution comes along, a number of Leeds men fight with some distinction in the Revolution. And so, yeah, I think the entire history, certainly of colonial New Jersey, if not the Middle Atlantic states, if not America itself, would have been different had Daniel Leeds not been forced to stop publishing his philosophical works and go on to publish his political attack works.
So, Brian, you've investigated Sasquatch, you've investigated the Jersey Devil. What monster or creature of the past are you investigating now?
Columbus, actually. The project I'm working on now is an examination of the various myths and legends about who really discovered America and how Columbus was a monster, and that you have people like the Welsh Prince Madoc or the Vikings or Chinese explorers or African explorers, and how believers in these different legends argue that it's their favorite who actually discovered America and not Columbus. And that what is really underneath all of this is virtually no actual historical evidence, but rather wish fulfillment and fantasy desires about not who discovered America, but who owns America, who runs America. And that the question of who came here first is a part of that. So that's what I'm examining. I'm examining the myths about who really discovered America.
Now, we just covered the early history of the Jersey Devil story today, and it's possible that we have questions about this early history or even questions about how the larger story of the New Jersey Devil developed. How can we contact you to pose these questions?
Well, you can just go to my webpage, my university webpage, beregal@kane.ed, and that should bring up my webpage. And on my webpage, you can get my email, which is brian.regal@gmail.com. You can read a bunch of my articles. You can see my other books and sort of all the stuff that I'm into. You can even go and look at my classes. I teach a bunch of classes on the history of science, technology, and medicine. And one class in particular, the history of pseudoscience, which is very popular.
Brian Regal, thank you so much for helping us get to the bottom of the Jersey Devil legend and for taking us through some of the early history of New Jersey.
My pleasure. That's what I do for a living.
Daniel Leeds was a man who wanted to do something valuable and good for his community. He believed in ideas from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and he wanted to share those ideas in practical ways with his neighbors. So he created an almanac. Almanacs offered the perfect venue for Leeds to convey scientific and reasoned ideas to his neighbors in ways that they could use. Because almanacs contained helpful information, such as important dates, information about when the sun would rise and set on any given day, tide tables, dates for known eclipses, and bits of helpful knowledge, such as Ben Franklin's "Early to bed and early to rise makes man healthy, wealthy, and wise." Now, as Brian noted, almanacs were really popular in Europe during the 17th century, which is exactly where Daniel Leeds got the idea to write one. However, given that the information almanacs included often relied on information about planetary movements and were presented with images of celestial figures, not everyone in the 17th and 18th centuries was comfortable with almanacs. And Daniel Leeds' fellow West Jersey Quakers were among those who were very uncomfortable with almanacs. In fact, the Quakers' discomfort with Leeds' almanac led them to destroy it. Now, Leeds did spend some time trying to reason with his fellow Quakers. He even went so far as to write and publish a book about his ideas and why they made sense. But this action only intensified their philosophical and religious dispute, which then escalated into vicious attacks. And these attacks included the Quakers labeling Leeds as Satan's harbinger. And thus, the Leeds Devil was born. Now, Brian believes that if we take the time to study myths and legends, like the Leeds and New Jersey Devil, we can see the issues of any given time more clearly. For example, if we trace the entry of Mother Leeds into the story of the Leeds Devil, we can see that it reflects a deep fear of women who wanted more of a say in their communities and churches, and of women who wanted more general equality between the sexes. In essence, one way to find out society's deepest and darkest fears throughout history is to explore and trace the origins of its monsters. You can find more information about Brian, his book, The Secret History of the Jersey Devil, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/192. What books are you reading this summer? I just told you about one of the books that the Omohundro Institute not only published, but placed on its own summer reading list, Molly Warsh's American Baroque. But now that we've told you what's on our reading list, what's on your reading list? Leave us a comment in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook because we'd really love to know. And if you're not yet a member of this community, join us. It's free to join. Just text BF World to 33444 and I'll send you the link. Finally, are there any monsters, myths, or legends associated with your state or local community? Tell me about them. Boston is a place with lots of tales. And of course, one of the tales I always heard growing up was the curse of the Bambino. The idea that the Red Sox would never again win a World Series after they traded Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees in 1920. Now I know you probably expected me to tell you a myth, legend, or curse from Boston from its early American period, but it's baseball season, and I do love my Red Sox. I do know of some of those other tales, so just send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.